There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, where everything shifts. And most people miss it. It's not when you argue. It's not when you walk away. It's not even when communication stops. It's the moment your emotional investment quietly dies. That's the moment the avoidant feels something they are completely unprepared for. A loss of control they cannot name. You see, avoidants are not wired to respond to emotional intensity the way most people are. When you chase them, when you over-explain, when you try to fix things, they feel safe in a strange, paradoxical way. Why? Because your emotional pursuit gives them structure. It tells them, you still care more than I do, and as long as that imbalance exists, they remain in control of the connection. But the second that changes, everything inside them begins to destabilize. And here's the part that most people misunderstand. Your silence alone doesn't scare them. Your distance alone doesn't shake them. What shakes them is the absence of emotional energy behind them. When you stop reacting, not as a strategy, but because something in you has genuinely shifted, that's when the avoidance starts to feel something unfamiliar. Not love, not regret, but uncertainty. And uncertainty is their greatest psychological threat, because now they can't reach you. Before, they knew exactly who you were, predictable, available, emotionally engaged. They could disappear and know you'd still be there. They could give you the bare minimum and still receive maximum emotional return. That was the dynamic. That was the unspoken contract. But now you've broken the pattern without warning. And the human mind, especially an avoidant mind, cannot tolerate a broken pattern without trying to fix it. So what happens next is not random. It's not coincidence. It's psychological compensation. At first, it's quiet, internal. They start replaying interactions in their head. Did something happen? Why did they feel different? Why didn't they react the way they usually do? And they won't say this out loud. They won't confront it directly, because that would require emotional exposure. And that's exactly what they avoid. Instead, they observe. They watch your behavior from a distance, trying to detect any trace of the old you. Any sign that this is temporary, any indication that you're still emotionally accessible. Because if you are, they can relax again. The system resets. Control is restored. But if you're not, that's when the panic begins. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but a quiet internal disturbance, a loss of certainty, a disruption of their emotional equilibrium. And understand this clearly. They are not panicking because they suddenly realized your worth. They are panicking because they lost access to something that once felt guaranteed. There's a difference, a critical one, because when something is guaranteed, it requires no effort. But when that guarantee disappears, the mind starts searching for ways to restore it. That's the beginning of their testing phase. Not from a place of deep emotional awakening, but from a need to reestablish psychological control. And this is where most people make the mistake that costs them everything. They misinterpret this shift as love, as realization, as transformation. But in reality, it's something far more primal. It's the mind reacting to the loss of certainty. You didn't just walk away, you removed the emotional fuel that kept the entire dynamic alive. And now, for the first time, they're standing in a space where they don't know where they stand with you. That's unfamiliar. That's uncomfortable. And for an avoidant, that's destabilizing. So before anything else happens, before the messages, before the tests, before the reappearance, it all begins here, in silence, in the quiet moment where they realize you don't feel the same anymore. And that realization doesn't inspire immediate action. It creates internal tension that they don't yet know how to resolve. Because when someone who once gave you certainty becomes unpredictable, the mind doesn't move on. It tries to regain control. And the moment they feel that loss of control is the moment the entire dynamic begins to reverse. And once that internal tension reaches a certain threshold, once the uncertainty becomes too uncomfortable to ignore, they don't explode into emotional confession. They don't suddenly become vulnerable, expressive, or deeply self-aware. That would require a level of emotional access they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Instead, they do something far more subtle and far more strategic. They reappear, but not in the way you expect. There's no grand apology, no deep conversation, no acknowledgement of what really happened. What you get instead is something that feels almost casual, a message that seems harmless on the surface. Hey, how have you been? Or, I just saw something that reminded me of you. It's light, It's neutral. It's designed to feel effortless. But you have to understand, this is not connection. This is calibration. They are not reaching out to rebuild the relationship. They are reaching out to measure it. Because right now, in their mind, one question matters more than anything else. Do I still have access to you the way I used to? And the only way they can answer that is through your response. This is where the psychology becomes precise. They deliberately avoid emotional depth in this moment because depth would expose them. They require accountability, clarity, and risk. And they're not ready for that. What they want is information without vulnerability, data without exposure. So they keep it surface level. But make no mistake, beneath that surface is intense observation. They are watching how quickly you reply. They are analyzing your tone. They are measuring your level of enthusiasm, your openness, your emotional availability. Every word you send becomes feedback. Every delay becomes a signal. Every shift in your energy becomes something they try to interpret. What they're really asking is simple. Are you still the same person I left? Because if you respond with warmth, excitement, and immediate availability, then in their mind, nothing has fundamentally changed. The dynamic is still intact. The emotional imbalance still exists. And most importantly, control is restored. But if you don't respond the way you used to, if there's space in your tone, restraint in your words, a sense of grounded detachment, they feel it immediately. And that's when the confusion deepens. Because now the script they relied on no longer works. Understand this clearly. Avoidants don't operate based on what you say. They operate based on what they feel from your behavior. You can tell them you've moved on. You can explain your growth. You can articulate your boundaries. But if your actions still communicate emotional availability, they won't believe the words. They believe patterns. And in this moment, they are testing whether your pattern has truly changed. That's why the casual approach is so effective for them. It lowers your guard. It invites you to respond without thinking. It creates an illusion of normalcy, as if nothing significant ever happened. And if you step back into that familiar rhythm, even briefly, you confirm everything they need to know. But if you don't, something shifts inside them because now they are faced with a version of you that doesn't behave predictably. And unpredictability forces attention. It forces them to think, to question, to reassess. This is the turning point where curiosity begins to replace certainty. Curiosity becomes an avoidance because far more powerful because they're not used to being the one to run. They're not used to being uncomfortable. They're understand their position in your world. That's the real objective. Because if their position is changed, if they are no longer at the center of your emotional focus, then everything they assumed about the dynamic begins to collapse. And once that collapse begins, they don't immediately accept it. They escalate. They try again in different ways to see if they can get a clear reaction from you. Because the human mind cannot tolerate ambiguity for long. It seeks resolution. And right now, you have become the source of that ambiguity. So when they come back casually, don't mistake it for simplicity, don't mistake it for sincerity. It's calculated in a way that even they may not fully understand. It's the mind trying to regain clarity without risking exposure. And your response in that moment determines everything that follows. The way you respond doesn't just answer their message. It answers the question they're too afraid to ask directly. And that question is this: do I still have the same place in your life, or have I already been replaced by your silence? And when that curiosity doesn't give them the clarity they're looking for, when your responses remain measured, grounded, and emotionally contained, they don't simply walk away and accept the shift. That will require certainty. That will require closure. And right now, they have neither. So the strategy changes. It becomes more provocative. Because if they can't read your emotions directly, they will try to trigger them. This is where the dynamic takes a darker, more psychologically complex turn. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of an unconscious need to break the ambiguity that now surrounds you. They need to know, do you still feel something, or are you truly gone? And the fastest way to answer that question is not through calm conversation. It's through emotional reaction. So they begin to create situations designed to pull something out of it. They might reach out and then disappear again. They might engage just enough to reopen the line of communication, only to withdraw without explanation. And what they're watching for isn't your words. It's your shift in behavior. Do you double text? Do you question their absence? Do you lean forward emotionally the moment they step back? Because if you do, the answer becomes clear to them. You're still emotionally invested. And if you're still invested, then despite everything that's changed on the surface, the core dynamic remains intact. But if you don't react, if their inconsistency is met with stability, if their distance is met with composure, they feel something they're not used to feeling, powerlessness. And that's where the escalation continues. Sometimes it becomes more visible. They might start posting things that seem intentionally crafted to get your attention. Signals of a new life, new people, new energy. Not necessarily because they've moved on, but because they want to see if you are still watching. If you feel something when you see it, if it pulls you out of your emotional center. Other times it becomes more direct, a subtle comment that feels slightly dismissive, a tone that feels colder than necessary, a behavior that in the past would have triggered you to seek clarity, to fix the tension, to restore connection. But now all of it serves one purpose, to provoke a response. Because in their internal logic, your reaction equals your attachment, and your attachment equals their position. So they push, not always consciously, not always with intention you can clearly point to, but consistently enough that if you step back, you begin to see the pattern, the reach and retreat, the presence and absence. The subtle friction designed to disrupt your emotional stability. And this is where most people lose the progress they fought so hard to build. Because the moment you react emotionally, whether it's frustration, confusion, jealousy, or even renewed affection, you give them exactly what they were searching for. Confirmation, you confirm that despite the silence, despite the distance, despite the apparent shift, they can still access your emotional world. And once that confirmation is established, everything resets. But if you don't react, if you observe without absorbing, if you remain centered while they fluctuate, something far more significant happens. S, you break the feedback loop. Because now their actions no longer produce the result they were designed to create. And when the behavior stops working, the mind is forced into a new state. It either adapts or it becomes destabilized. For an avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory. They are used to regulating distance, not chasing clarity. They are used to disengaging when things feel intense, not leaning in when things feel uncertain. But your lack of reaction creates a kind of psychological vacuum. There is no emotional feedback for them to interpret, no signal to guide their next move, no predictable response to anchor their behavior. And in that vacuum, something begins to shift. Because now, for the first time, they are the ones experiencing what they once created in you. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, when prolonged, doesn't just create curiosity, it creates tension, a tension that seeks resolution. So they push again, maybe in a different way, maybe with a different tone, maybe with a slightly more direct attempt to get your attention. But the objective remains the same, to feel something from you that reassures them of their place. And your power in this moment is not in what you say. It's in what you don't give. Because when you no longer respond from emotional impulse, but from conscious awareness, you change the entire structure of the interaction. You move from being reactive to being intentional. And that shift is not just noticed, it's felt. So when they try to trigger you, understand what's really happening beneath the surface. It's not random behavior. It's not meaningless inconsistency. It's a test. A test to see if the version of you they once controlled still exists. And the way you respond, or choose not to, answers that question more powerfully than anything you could ever say. Because in the end, the person who maintains emo, rotational control defines the direction of the connection. And if you hold that position, if you remain grounded, emotionally disciplined, and no longer available in the way you once were, something begins to happen that they never anticipated. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, and then all at once. The structure they relied on collapses. Because up until this point, every move they made was based on an assumption that no matter how inconsistent they were, No matter how distant or unpredictable they became, your emotional presence would remain intact. That you would feel, react, engage, and ultimately keep the connection alive on your end, even when they withdrew on theirs. But now, that assumption no longer holds. And without that assumption, they lose something far more significant than the relationship itself. They lose psychological certainty. And when certainty disappears, the mind doesn't stay calm. It starts searching. It starts looping. It starts trying to reconstruct what it no longer understands. This is the phase where the avoidant begins to experience something they've spent most of their life avoiding. Not your emotions, but their own. Because your silence is no longer passive. It's definitive. It's not a tactic designed to get a reaction. It's not a pause before re-engagement. It's a shift in identity, a withdrawal of emotional availability that feels real, not temporary. And that's what destabilizes them. At first, they may try to rationalize it. They're just busy. They'll come back. This is probably a phase. The mind looks for familiar explanations to reduce discomfort. But as time passes and your behavior remains consistent, those explanations begin to fall apart. And what replaces them is something much heavier: doubt. Not just about you, but about themselves. Because now they are forced to confront a question they never had to ask before. What if I miscalculated? What if the distance they created didn't preserve the connection, but slowly dismantled it? What if the person they thought would always be there actually left? And this is where the internal experience becomes difficult for them to process, because avoidants are not practiced in sitting with emotional loss. They are practiced in creating distance to avoid it. But now, distance is no longer something they control. It's something they are experiencing from the other side. And that shift changes everything. They may begin to think about you more often, not in a romanticized, idealized way, but in a questioning, almost analytical way, replaying moments, reinterpreting your behavior, trying to identify the exact point where things changed. But the answer they're searching for doesn't exist in a single moment. It exists in a pattern they didn't take seriously when it was happening. Your gradual withdrawal, your emotional exhaustion, your quiet decision to stop investing where there was no reciprocity. And now they're trying to make sense of something that can't be undone through a single action. So what do? They circle back, not always with clarity, not always with intention, but with a sense of urgency they don't fully understand. A message, a reappearance, a sudden shift in behavior that feels out of character. And to someone on the outside, it might look like realization, like growth, like they've finally understood your value. But internally, it's more complex than that. It's not used about you. It's about restoring a sense of control they've lost. Because when someone who once provided emotional certainty becomes unavailable, it creates a kind of psychological tension that demands resolution. And the mind will pursue that resolution even if it doesn't yet know how to approach it in a healthy, direct way. So they reach out, they try again, they test in different ways. But here's the critical distinction. Their return is not always driven by emotional readiness. It's often driven by emotional disruption. And if you don't understand that, you risk misinterpreting their actions and stepping back into a dynamic that has already shown you its limitations. Because real change is not measured by their reappearance. It's measured by their consistency, their clarity, and their willingness to meet you at the level you've grown into. And if that's not present, then nothing has truly changed. Only the direction of the pressure. So as they circle back, as they attempt to re-enter your space, the question is no longer about what they feel. The question is about what you've learned. Because the power you've built in your silence, in your restraint, in your emotional discipline, that's not something to abandon the moment they return. That's something to protect. Because the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. When someone only realizes your value after losing access to you, what they're responding to is not who you were when you gave everything. It's who you became when you stopped.